Why was my mother treated as if she didn't belong here, right in the restaurant where? Welcome to Trend Reddit. Today's story is about Mrs. Pearl, an elderly, loyal customer of a restaurant where she has been celebrating special occasions and enjoying a warm community atmosphere for years. However, on her birthday, when she visited the restaurant, she encountered a new server with a cold, disdainful attitude who even refused to serve her, implying that she didn't belong there. What caused this attitude, and what will happen when the staff rejects her? Join us as we dive into this story. Mrs. Pearl stepped into the restaurant, expecting the familiar warmth that had always greeted her over the years. This place had been a refuge, a comforting setting where she had shared countless meals, celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and many quiet moments of reflection. Today was one of those special days. It was her birthday. She had reserved her table just yesterday, looking forward to a pleasant evening filled with the familiar sights, sounds, and aromas that made this restaurant feel like a second home. But something was different today. Mrs. Pearl noticed it almost immediately. The usual friendly faces seemed to be missing, and the staff's warmth was replaced with a noticeable chill in the air. As her eyes scanned the room, taking in the gentle hum of conversations and the clinking of dishes, she felt a sense of unease. Her gaze settled on a young waiter behind the counter, a face she hadn't seen before. Unlike the usual welcoming smiles, his glance was brief, almost dismissive, before he looked back down at his notepad, his expression distant and uninviting. Mrs. Pearl brushed off the unsettling feeling. Maybe he was simply tired after a long shift, she thought. There was no need to assume the worst. With her usual grace, she approached the counter, hoping for a simple acknowledgement or a polite smile, but neither came. Instead, she stood waiting, aware that she was being overlooked, as if she weren't standing right there in front of him. After a few awkward moments, Mrs. Pearl cleared her throat softly and smiled. "Hello, I have a reservation under the name Pearl," she said, her voice calm and polite, as always. The waiter glanced up, his gaze lingering on her for a second too long. She noticed the faint flicker of something in his eyes, irritation, perhaps, or maybe something even colder. But whatever it wasn't friendly. Without so much as a nod, he responded flatly, "There are no tables available." Mrs. Pearl frowned slightly. "I called yesterday and confirmed my reservation," she explained, her tone still gentle but tinged with a hint of confusion. Maybe he had simply missed her name, she reasoned. But the waiter's expression didn't soften. Instead, he sighed audibly, his tone sharp with impatience as he repeated, "I said there are no tables available." He didn't even check the reservation list or apologize, he simply waved his hand dismissively, indicating she should leave. There was no explanation, no sense of politeness, just a wall of indifference that Mrs. Pearl hadn't expected, especially not here. A tightening formed in her chest, a feeling all too familiar to her. She had encountered this kind of quiet dismissal before. The tone, the indifference, the unspoken judgment, it was something she knew far too well from her younger days. But not here. Not in a place she loved, a place she had come to think of as a safe space. Determined to remain composed, Mrs. Pearl tried one more time. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice steady though her disbelief was clear. "Perhaps I can wait by the counter until something opens up." The waiter barely looked at her as he crossed his arms over his chest, his smirk faint but unmistakable. "There's nothing for you here," he replied, the words laced with something that felt darker than mere indifference. "You should leave." Mrs. Pearl's heart tightened as she took in the sheer coldness of his words. She felt something heavier beneath them, something that reminded her of past experiences she'd rather forget. It was clear now, this wasn't about a simple mix-up or lack of tables. It was about who she was, or perhaps more accurately, how he saw her. His expression, his dismissive tone, even his posture, all of it revealed a disdain she had encountered too many times in her life. For a brief moment, she felt herself shrink, memories rushing back of other places, other times when she'd been treated like this, told in subtle ways that she didn't belong. But this was different. She had a right to be here, she reminded herself. She had been coming here for years, contributing to this very community. She straightened her back slightly, steeling herself against the weight of his judgment. Her dignity wasn't something that could be handed out by others, it was something she carried within herself, no matter how others might try to strip it away. She looked back at the young waiter, her gaze calm and steady as she placed her hands on the counter. "Perhaps you don't know who I am," she said, her voice soft, hoping he might reconsider his stance if he knew she was a regular, a loyal customer. If you love intimate and touching stories, don't forget to click the subscribe button so you don't miss any videos. Click the notification bell to update our new stories as soon as possible. The waiter merely chuckled, shaking his head in mild amusement. "I don't care who you are," he responded with a smirk, his voice dripping with contempt. "There's no place for people like you here." The words hit her like a physical blow, leaving her momentarily speechless. She had heard similar phrases before, felt their sting many times over the years, but it never stopped cutting deep. She looked around, noticing the other diners glancing at her, some quickly looking away, others watching with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every time she had been told she didn't belong, every subtle or blatant hint that she was somehow less than those around her. She considered walking out, letting this moment pass as she had so many times before. But a fire stirred inside her, a resolve that had been built over years of enduring quiet, unspoken slights. No, she wouldn't leave, not today. This place was just as much hers as it was anyone else's, and she would make that clear. So, with unwavering calm, she looked directly at the waiter and said, "I'd like to speak to the manager." The waiter's smirk faltered just slightly, a flash of irritation passing over his face before he composed himself again. He didn't respond, and Mrs. Pearl held her ground, knowing that, today, she would not be dismissed so easily. As Mrs. Pearl waited for the manager, a tense silence settled around her. The waiter, clearly irked by her persistence, leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing as though he'd finally grown tired of her defiance. She could sense the disdain in his gaze, his unspoken judgment simmering just beneath the surface. His voice dropped slightly, low enough to make the next words sting all the more. "Do you really think you belong here?" he sneered, casting a condescending glance at her worn coat and simple shoes. It wasn't the first time Mrs. Pearl had encountered this kind of treatment. She'd grown up in an era where people like her were often reminded of their place in society, a place others had deemed for them, always beneath, always unworthy. Yet here she was, in a restaurant that had become part of her community, somewhere she thought she could enjoy without the weight of judgment or scorn. But today, all of those assumptions had been stripped away by the sneer of a stranger, a young man who didn't know her at all, yet assumed he knew everything he needed to. Mrs. Pearl took a deep breath, centering herself. She wasn't about to raise her voice or lose her composure. Years of experience had taught her that power was found in quiet dignity, in not giving others the reaction they anticipated. Looking him squarely in the eyes, she said, "I'd still like to speak to the manager, please." The waiter's smirk widened, a flicker of amusement in his eyes, as if to say, "Go ahead. See if it makes a difference." He remained unbothered, his arms folded across his chest, and a hint of defiance in his posture. For a moment, it felt as though he was daring her to give up, to leave quietly and admit defeat. But she wouldn't. She had endured too much over the years to let someone like him chase her out. She stood her ground, her hands steady on the counter, her voice unshaken. After what felt like an eternity, the manager finally appeared, looking rushed and somewhat flustered. Mrs. Pearl could tell by his expression that he assumed this would be a quick interaction, a minor disruption he'd need to smooth over with a few practiced words before he could return to the evening's other duties. But as his eyes landed on Mrs. Pearl, his expression shifted ever so slightly, from indifference to mild discomfort. She noticed it, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, or maybe just an awareness of the tension in the air. "Good evening," he greeted her, his tone polite but rehearsed, as though he were already bracing himself to deliver an apology without truly understanding its purpose. "I'm sorry for any inconvenience. How can I help you tonight?" Mrs. Pearl didn't immediately respond. She took a moment to gather her thoughts, to steady herself, before addressing him directly. "I made a reservation for tonight." Under the name Pearl, she began, her voice clear and calm. "I've been a customer here for years, and I was looking forward to a quiet evening. But when I arrived, I was told there were no tables available, even though I confirmed my reservation yesterday." The manager gave a slight nod, appearing attentive, though Mrs. Pearl could tell he was still trying to gauge the situation. He glanced at the waiter, who remained standing nearby, his smirk now partially concealed, though his indifference was plain for all to see. The manager cleared his throat, then looked back at Mrs. Pearl with a practiced smile. "I apologize for the misunderstanding. We sometimes have oversights. I'm sure we can find you a table if you're willing to wait just a moment." But Mrs. Pearl wasn't satisfied with the manager's response. This wasn't just about finding a table or smoothing over a minor inconvenience. It was about something deeper, something she wasn't about to ignore or brush aside. "Thank you," she replied evenly, maintaining her composure. "But I believe this isn't simply a matter of finding a table. I was told by your staff member, quite directly, that I don't belong here." Her words hung in the air, her voice soft but carrying an unmistakable weight. She watched the manager's expression shift, his attempt at a quick apology faltering as the full implication of her statement sank in. He glanced back at the waiter, whose earlier smugness had begun to give way to a faint hint of unease. I assure you, Mrs. Pearl, that's not how we treat our customers here," the manager stammered, his confidence wavering as he looked around, aware of the growing attention from other patrons. The other diners, some of whom had been watching the exchange from the beginning, were now fully engaged, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity and unease. Mrs. Pearl took a slow, steady breath, feeling the familiar sting of humiliation pressing in on her, but she refused to let it consume her. "I understand," she said, her tone firm but calm. "But I think it's important that we address the root of the issue, not just the result." The manager swallowed, visibly uncomfortable now, as he glanced nervously from Mrs. Pearl to the waiter. It was clear he was beginning to understand that this wouldn't be resolved with a simple apology or a quick seating arrangement. There was more at stake here, a matter of respect, a matter of principles. "Of course, Mrs. Pearl," he managed, his voice quieter now, laced with a hint of discomfort. "I assure you, we will address this appropriately. We value all of our customers." Mrs. Pearl met his gaze, her expression resolute. "I hope so," she replied. "Because tonight, it certainly didn't feel that way." The quiet strength in her words struck a chord in the room, her calm insistence on being heard setting an example of dignity even in the face of blatant disrespect. She wasn't here to create a scene or to prove a point. She was here because she believed she had a right to be here, to enjoy her evening, and to demand the respect she had earned. As the manager nodded, visibly chastened, Mrs. Pearl knew the conversation was only just beginning. And this time, she would ensure it was one they wouldn't easily forget. Mrs. Pearl could feel the weight of her words sinking into the manager, whose polite demeanor began to falter. She had seen this before, a quick attempt at damage control, an effort to appease and move on without fully addressing the deeper problem. But today, she wasn't willing to let it slide. Not here. Not in a place she had come to trust and call her own over the years. The air around her grew thick with tension as other diners watched, some whispering softly among themselves, others visibly uncomfortable but unable to look away. The manager cleared his throat, his gaze darting to the waiter, who was now shifting uneasily. The smirk that had been so evident moments before had all but vanished, replaced with an air of uncertainty as he realized the situation might not be dismissed so easily. He looked down, avoiding Mrs. Pearl's steady gaze, his earlier arrogance quickly draining as the manager seemed to reassess his role in the matter. "We take these matters very seriously, Mrs. Pearl," the manager said, his tone louder now, as if he were speaking not just to her but to everyone in the restaurant. "I assure you, this behavior is not representative of our values. I'll address this personally." Mrs. Pearl held her gaze steady, sensing the insincerity woven into his words, and replied softly, "It's not just about me. It's about anyone who walks through these doors expecting respect. This isn't just about what happened tonight, it's about ensuring this doesn't happen again." The manager's expression shifted from polite regret to visible discomfort. The diners around them were watching with greater intensity now, some even pulling out their phones to record the exchange. The rising tension was palpable, and the manager was acutely aware that this conversation was no longer confined to a private interaction. What had begun as a simple request for respect was now turning into a public statement about the values of the restaurant and how they treated their guests. In a final attempt to placate her, the manager motioned for her to follow him, gesturing to a booth near the back of the restaurant. "Please, Mrs. Pearl, let's get you seated. We value your patronage, and I'm here to make sure your evening is pleasant." But Mrs. Pearl remained rooted to her spot. Her composure, her quiet dignity, it all came from years of facing this kind of dismissal, of being treated as though her concerns didn't matter, as though she should be content with superficial apologies. Tonight, however, was different. Tonight, she felt a new kind of resolve, a determination not to let this moment pass without leaving an impact. "Thank you, but I'd rather wait until we can have an honest conversation," she said firmly, her voice calm but filled with purpose. "I don't want to just take a seat and move on as if nothing happened." The manager's discomfort deepened. He looked around, noticing the growing interest from other patrons, their eyes fixed on him and Mrs. Pearl. The weight of their scrutiny was bearing down on him, and he struggled to maintain his composure under the pressure. The waiter, standing off to the side, finally seemed to grasp the magnitude of the situation. His earlier cockiness had evaporated, and now he looked visibly shaken, realizing that this incident was spiraling beyond his control. He opened his mouth as if to offer an apology, but the words caught in his throat. The once confident smirk was long gone, replaced by an anxious tension as he shifted uncomfortably, fidgeting with his notepad. Mrs. Pearl looked at him calmly, unwavering. "Respect is a basic courtesy," she said, her voice carrying through the room, though she hadn't raised it. "It's not something to be given or taken based on assumptions or judgments. It's a right I have, just like anyone else who enters here." The manager swallowed, feeling the weight of her words and the eyes of everyone around them. For the first time, he seemed genuinely affected, the gravity of the situation beginning to sink in. What had begun as a simple misunderstanding, in his mind, had quickly escalated into a public confrontation, a moment where his choices and the values of the restaurant were being held to account. "I understand, Mrs. Pearl," he said finally, his voice quieter now, more respectful. "And I apologize sincerely. Please believe me when I say that we will address this, and that it will not happen again." Mrs. Pearl gave him a small nod, acknowledging his words. "I'll hold you to that," she replied, her gaze unyielding. She wasn't just here for herself, she was standing up for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly, for anyone who had ever been made to feel unwelcome or less than. And she wanted to make it clear that change had to start here, in this moment. As the tension in the room continued to build, she felt the collective weight of every eye upon her, their silent support lending strength to her resolve. She wasn't here to create a scene, she was here to demand respect, and that demand was resonating far beyond just her own experience. This was a matter of dignity, of justice, and she was willing to see it through. The manager, sensing the need to act decisively, turned to the waiter, his voice firm. "You're dismissed for the evening. We'll discuss this further in private." He shot Mrs. Pearl a look of acknowledgement, a silent promise to address her concerns in a meaningful way. The waiter, now pale and visibly shaken, left the room without another word, the gravity of his actions finally clear. With the room still buzzing, Mrs. Pearl took her seat, her heart steady, her purpose fulfilled for the moment. She knew the impact of her actions today went beyond just herself. This was a stand she had taken for all those who had ever felt marginalized or disrespected. As she settled in, she felt a quiet satisfaction, a resolve to continue standing up for what was right, no matter how uncomfortable it might make others feel. Just as Mrs. Pearl settled into her seat, the restaurant's door swung open, and in walked Marcus, her son and the owner of the restaurant. His tall figure exuded a quiet authority as he looked around, his expression tense, his eyes searching. Moments earlier, a video clip of the confrontation had come to his attention. A post captioned, "Elderly woman mistreated at local restaurant" had quickly spread online, and the central figure in the video was unmistakably his mother. His heart had sunk watching the clip, witnessing the humiliation she had endured and the disrespect she had been shown in his own establishment. In that moment, anger and disbelief had surged within him. This wasn't just a customer being mistreated, this was his mother, the very woman who had instilled in him the values of kindness, respect, and community that his restaurant was meant to embody. The shame of that moment, captured and shared widely, had spurred him immediately to action. He dropped everything, grabbed his keys, and driven over with a single purpose: to make this right. As Marcus entered, the room fell silent, diners pausing mid-bite and casting furtive glances his way, some recognizing him, others realizing that something significant was unfolding. The manager and the waiter, who had retreated near the back, exchanged uneasy glances, the confidence they'd tried to maintain rapidly waning under Marcus's focused, determined gaze. The young waiter, who had been so dismissive of Mrs. Pearl, suddenly looked pale, his earlier smugness now replaced with growing dread as he understood who Marcus was, and, more devastatingly, his relation to the woman he'd mistreated. Without a word, Marcus walked straight to the counter where his mother sat. Her back was straight, her expression calm but resolute, and the pride in her eyes upon seeing him was unmistakable. She gave him a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that she knew he would handle this with the same quiet dignity she had shown. Marcus turned to face the manager and the waiter, his gaze cold and unyielding. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of controlled anger. It was the kind of voice that brooked no evasion or excuse, the kind that expected accountability. The manager stammered, stepping forward in an attempt to explain, but Marcus silenced him with a single, unwavering look. His focus then shifted to the waiter, whose face had drained of all color. For a moment, the waiter tried to muster up the courage to explain himself, but under Marcus's intense gaze, the words caught in his throat. Gone was the smugness, the arrogance. All that remained was a young man realizing, too late, the depth of his mistake. "You," Marcus said, his voice steady, his words aimed directly at the waiter. "Why was my mother treated like she didn't belong here, in her own son's restaurant?" The silence that followed was thick with tension, every eye in the restaurant glued to the confrontation. The waiter opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He looked down, his earlier bravado completely shattered, the reality of his actions settling heavily on him. Without giving the young man a chance to respond, Marcus took a slow breath, his next words deliberate and final. "You're fired," he announced, his voice clear, loud enough for everyone to hear. The words hung in the air like a final judgment, the weight of them undeniable. "Get out of my restaurant," he added, his tone resolute, leaving no room for negotiation or forgiveness. The waiter, now visibly shaken, nodded, gathering his things in silence, his head bowed as he made his way toward the door, the footsteps of regret heavy beneath him. The tension in the room remained palpable, the diners absorbing the gravity of the moment. Turning to the manager, Marcus's expression remained stern, though his tone softened slightly. "And you," he said, "you were trusted to uphold the values of this place, to make sure that every customer is treated with respect, especially someone like my mother who has been here for years. Clearly, that didn't happen today." The manager swallowed, his eyes reflecting a mix of shame and understanding. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I didn't realize the full extent," he stammered, his earlier professionalism now stripped down to raw apology. "This isn't just about a single incident," Marcus replied, his voice firm. "It's about the values this restaurant was built on, and those values were ignored. What happened today was unacceptable, and it's my responsibility to make sure it doesn't happen again." As Marcus spoke, he turned to address the entire room, his gaze moving from table to table, meeting the eyes of each diner. "To everyone here," he announced, "I apologize for what you witnessed today. No one, whether they're here every week or walking in for the first time, should ever feel unwelcome or unworthy of respect, especially not here." A murmur spread through the crowd, nods of agreement visible among the patrons. Some had their phones out, capturing his words, the story now spreading far beyond the walls of the restaurant. Marcus understood the significance of this moment. It wasn't just about restoring his mother's dignity, it was about publicly standing against the kind of treatment she had endured, about showing the community and everyone who would hear of this incident that such behavior had no place here. Finally, Marcus turned back to his mother, his expression softened, his anger replaced with regret and admiration. He reached out, taking her hands in his, and in a quiet voice, filled with sincerity, he said, "I'm so sorry, Mom. This should never have happened." "Not here." Mrs. Pearl gave him a small, proud smile, her eyes reflecting both forgiveness and pride. "You did the right thing," she replied softly, her voice steady, carrying the same strength and dignity she'd shown throughout the evening. As they stood together, mother and son, in the center of the restaurant, they were a symbol of resilience and respect, a testament to the importance of standing up against injustice, even when it would be easier to look the other way. In that moment, the restaurant wasn't just a place to eat. It had become a space of significance, a place where dignity had been defended, and where a son's love and respect for his mother became a powerful act of justice. As the fired waiter left the restaurant, the remaining diners watched in silence, absorbing the gravity of what had just transpired. Marcus stood beside his mother, his anger softened but his resolve unbroken. The public dismissal had marked more than just a response to the waiter's behavior, it was a powerful statement to everyone present that respect and dignity were not optional values in this establishment. The manager, visibly humbled, took a step forward, his head slightly bowed. "Marcus," he began, his voice subdued, "I can't apologize enough for how your mother was treated. This isn't how we should conduct ourselves. I understand that now, and I assure you this will never happen again." But Marcus didn't look at him. Instead, he turned his attention back to his mother, his expression filled with both remorse and admiration. She had handled the entire ordeal with patience and grace, not once letting anger or indignation mar her poise. For a moment, he simply held her gaze, knowing how deeply this incident must have affected her, yet recognizing the strength in her quiet resilience. His mother had taught him everything about respect, about the importance of standing firm without raising your voice. Today, she had exemplified that lesson in the most poignant way. Finally, Marcus addressed the diners, his tone calm but resolute. "To everyone here tonight, I'm sorry for what you witnessed. This place, my mother's favorite place, has always been a space of community and inclusivity. It was built on the principle that every person deserves respect, no matter who they are. I promise that I will take steps to ensure that incidents like this don't happen again. Thank you for your patience and for standing with us through this difficult moment." The diners nodded in silent understanding, and a few murmurs of support rippled through the crowd. Some even clapped quietly, a small but heartfelt gesture of appreciation for the way Marcus had handled the situation. Those who had initially pulled out their phones to record the confrontation now put them away, sensing that they had been witness to something far more meaningful than just another viral moment. This was a lesson in respect, dignity, and accountability, and many would carry it with them beyond the restaurant doors. Turning back to his mother, Marcus extended his hand. "Shall we sit, Mom?" he asked softly. Mrs. Pearl nodded, a small, proud smile on her lips. She took his arm, and together they walked to a booth near the window. As they sat down, the tension in the restaurant slowly dissipated, replaced by a quiet sense of unity and respect that seemed to settle over the room. The diners resumed their conversations, but the earlier discomfort was gone, replaced by a shared understanding of the values that Marcus had just reaffirmed. The restaurant's atmosphere felt renewed, as if it had been reminded of its true purpose. A few minutes later, the manager approached their table, a look of genuine remorse in his eyes. "Mrs. Pearl, Marcus," he said softly, "I'd like to offer my deepest apologies once again. I failed to uphold the standards we pride ourselves on here, and I can assure you that I will do everything in my power to make sure this never happens again." Mrs. Pearl regarded him with a kind, measured gaze. "I appreciate your words," she replied, her tone gentle but firm. "But actions speak louder than apologies. I hope you'll remember that." The manager nodded earnestly. We'll be making changes, ma'am, he assured her. This has shown me that there's work to be done, and I won't take that responsibility lightly. As he walked away, Marcus looked across the table at his mother, admiration shining in his eyes. You know, Mom, you've always taught me that dignity isn't about demanding respect but showing others how to treat you by the way you carry yourself. He smiled. Tonight, you reminded everyone here of that lesson. Mrs. Pearl gave a soft chuckle, reaching across the table to pat his hand. And you reminded me, my dear, that we must never tire of standing up for what's right, no matter how many times it's tested. Her gaze drifted around the room, taking in the warmth that was slowly returning to the space. Sometimes, she added thoughtfully, we have to remind others of the values they've forgotten, even in places we trust. The evening wore on, and Marcus and Mrs. Pearl enjoyed their meal, each bite accompanied by shared memories and light conversation, the heaviness of the earlier incident gradually lifting. As they spoke, several patrons quietly approached their table, each one offering words of support and appreciation. Some thanked Marcus for standing up so firmly, others expressed their admiration for Mrs. Pearl's grace and resilience. The final visitor was a woman in her early 30s, who approached Mrs. Pearl with a tentative smile. I just wanted to say, thank you, the woman said, her voice soft but sincere. My mother went through similar things when I was young, and seeing you stand so tall tonight reminded me of her strength. You're an inspiration to us all. Mrs. Pearl's eyes softened, and she gave the woman's hand a gentle squeeze. Thank you, dear. We're all stronger than we know. With a small nod, the woman returned to her seat, leaving Mrs. Pearl with a renewed sense of purpose and pride. She was here not only for herself but for others, a living example that dignity could withstand even the harshest judgment, that respect was not just an ideal but a right worth defending. As the evening came to a close, Marcus settled the bill, and the two of them rose from their booth. As they prepared to leave, he took his mother's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. Let's make sure this place stays true to its roots, Mom, he said with a smile. Mrs. Pearl nodded, her eyes glistening with quiet pride. Yes, let's do that. Together. And with that, they walked out of the restaurant, side by side, each step a testament to resilience, respect, and the power of standing one's ground. Today's story, I want to emphasize that respect and fairness are values that cannot be compromised and that everyone has the power to make changes, so that society becomes more fair and civilized. Thank you very much for listening to my story. Your concern and sharing are precious. Wish you always have good luck and happiness in life.